Aneurysm. Aneurysm is a weakened region in the artery that bulges, makes the artery bulge out, okay? And it forms a bulging sac that keeps pulsating with each heartbeat. Because aneurysms happen in arteries and they are under really high pressure, right? So every time blood gets pumped out, they pulsate. And because they are a bulging sac with weakened thin walls, they are at risk for rupture anytime. So you can have an aneurysm and not even know it. So a lot of times aneurysms cannot be detected. People don't even know it until it ruptures. But can you detect an aneurysm? Yes, you can. You can use techniques like MRI for looking at aneurysms in the brain. You can use CT scan, or you can use angiography for measuring aneurysm in the heart, the brain, abdomen, legs, and so on. So angiography basically uses X-ray to study the inside of the blood vessels in different parts of the body. Okay, so there are one type of aneurysm. Dissecting aneurysm happens when blood accumulates longitudinally in between the walls of the artery and separates the walls of the artery. So if you have an artery like this, so the walls basically separate longitudinally. That's a vessel. This wall separates from the vessel. Okay, so that's called a dissecting aneurysm. Now, like I said, they are under a high pressure, so they are at risk for rupturing anytime, and when they rupture, they are going to cause a hemorrhage and internal bleeding. So if you're rupturing an artery internally, it causes blood to ooze out into the internal organs, right? And that's never a good thing. There are three main types of aneurysms. The most common sites are the abdominal aorta, the renal arteries, and the arterial circle of the brain that we'll look at. And you can have an abdominal aortic or a thoracic aortic aneurysm. Abdominal aortic is when the abdominal aorta has an aneurysm, and thoracic aortic is when the thoracic aorta has an aneurysm. And then you can have a cerebral aneurysm in the brain. Out of these, the most common is the abdominal aortic aneurysm. Okay, so any of these, when they rupture, they are going to cause an internal hemorrhage. So they can't cause a hemorrhage after rupturing. But if they have not ruptured, they can actually put pressure on other structures internally. And one of the most common causes for aneurysm is atherosclerosis, meaning deposition of lipids. Because sclera means stiffening and hardening, and athero means gruel, something sticky. Right, the most common cause is hypertension and atherosclerosis. This picture shows abdominal, let me use a pointer there. So there's the aneurysm you can see, and this one is the abdominal aorta. These are the pelvic bones, so you see the abdominal region. That's the bulging aneurysm. So this is the aneurysm itself, and this is the abdominal aorta. Alright, so everything in the body comes down to the blood pressure, because without proper mean arterial pressure, you won't have proper tissue perfusion. If you don't have proper tissue perfusion, the tissues aren't getting enough oxygen and nutrients, right? So blood pressure is one of the most important things in the body. Okay, so there are a few things that control the blood flow and blood pressure, a few mechanisms. First one is the baroreceptor reflex. Let me write that down. Baroreceptor reflex. Now, the baroreceptor reflex is the homeostatic mechanism with which we maintain the blood pressure at constant levels. And another important factor that affects blood pressure is the kidney, filtration in the kidney, specifically the renin-angiotensin system. We'll talk more about this in the urinary system, but just keep in mind for now, kidney modulates the fluids in the body. It removes excess fluid if needed, and it retains fluids in the body if needed. So the volume changes in the body fluids affect blood pressure. So these are two very important things that you need to remember. Now, the heart itself is a very important structure in sensing any changes to blood pressure, and the sensory receptors on the heart are located in two main regions. The first one is this one. So on the internal carotid artery, and at the junction of the external and internal carotid artery, there are baroreceptors known as the carotid sinus. Okay, so we're talking about sensory receptors. Okay, and the other sensory receptor is located on the aortic arch. Here you have the aortic arch, and these baroreceptors also sense changes in blood pressure. So these sensory receptors are mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors basically respond to any stretching in the blood vessels, okay, due to changes in blood pressure, that is, they respond to any changes. Okay, some other components that control blood pressure is obviously the nervous system, specifically the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, in general, you probably remember that parasympathetic nervous system has a rest and digest response, so it has a calming effect on the body, and sympathetic nervous system or sympathetic components have a fight or flight response, so they increase the heart rate, right? So let's look at the parasympathetic components first. Okay, so there are two major nerves that you need to know. First one is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve is cranial nerve number 9, and the other nerve that has a parasympathetic role is the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. Now, both of these nerves project any changes in blood pressure to the medulla oblongata in the brain. And medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata then sends in signal back to the heart via the vagus nerve, and this leads to decrease in heart rate, and in turn you have reduced stroke volume. Okay, now the other component that controls blood pressure, a component of the nervous system, is sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system, I should write that down. You have sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system mainly controls the heart rate by innervating the kidneys and producing vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction. When you vasoconstrict, you basically reduce the opening of the blood vessel. When you reduce the opening of the blood vessel, the peripheral resistance increases, which in turn increases the blood pressure. Imagine again holding a water hose. When you constrict the water hose at the tip, water comes out with a lot more force because you're constricting, okay, because it's under a lot of pressure. So it leads to increase in blood pressure. Now the other thing sympathetic nervous system do is to innervate the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. Now, a lot of different organs are involved in the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, but finally the kidney adjusts the blood volume to adjust the blood pressure. We won't talk about this in too much detail just yet, but please keep this mechanism in the back of your mind. So what happens when there's a drop in blood pressure? When there's a drop in blood pressure, the baroreceptors send a message to the medulla oblongata, and there is an increase in sympathetic activity. At the same time, there's a decrease in parasympathetic activity. And when you have increase in parasympathetic activity, it leads to vasoconstriction. And at the same time, the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism causes increase in blood volume, which will also lead to increase in cardiac output. Okay, when you vasoconstrict and you increase cardiac output, constriction causes increase in blood pressure, and the blood pressure returns to normal. So what you're looking at is the carotid sinus. So if you have heard of carotid massage, when people they're anxious or they have a high blood pressure, you've heard of carotid massage. When somebody does a carotid massage, they really activate the baroreceptors in the internal carotid artery right over here. Now, even when in karate, they're taught to, in self-defense classes, in karate, we were taught to hit in the neck right on the carotid artery. Now, when somebody hits the carotid artery, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system immediately, too fast, too much and too fast, right? And the blood pressure really falls low and the person passes out, right? So if you hit somebody in the carotid artery, they'll really pass out, okay? And then we also have chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors basically sense any changes in any chemicals, pH, carbon dioxide, oxygen, etc. Okay, so these chemoreceptors are present in these. Right over here, you have the carotid body. On the external carotid artery, and then you also have aortic body. Now in this picture, it's not an appropriate representation, but the aortic bodies are present at the branching of the common carotid on the aortic arch. Okay, so aortic bodies and carotid body are chemoreceptors that sense any changes in the blood chemistry. And the carotid body is innervated by glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 9, and the aortic body is innervated by the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. So both of those nerves have a parasympathetic effect, which is a rest and digest response to control the blood pressure.